Chapter 6. Matthew was furious. He didn't know what else to do when it came to Kaylyn Fisher. He had made offers, she turned them down and wasn't a bit interested in anything he said. She had nothing, and yet she felt like she had everything. That fact alone left him baffled. After making his last offer and being told that she'd rather terminate the pregnancy, Matthew didn't know what else to propose. He doubted the possibility of her terminating the child, but he knew it was better not to upset her. Running his fingers through his hair in frustration, Matthew eased back in his chair, trying to clear his head of the events of the past days. "You look stressed," a voice said. Matthew held up his head and saw that it was Jason, his best friend. "I'm always stressed," Matthew replied dully. "Nope, this is not work stress," he acknowledged, raising a brow. "I'm fine," he sighed, shrugging off his jacket. "What brings you here?" Jason went forward and took a seat in front of Matthew's desk. "Was off to lunch and thought I'd stop by." "I fired Tina today," he said coolly. Matthew looked at him curiously. "Your assistant Tina?" Jason nodded. "Yup, that's the one." "Why?" "I thought she was the best you've ever had," Matthew stated, finding it hard to believe, seeing that at one point Tina and her excellent secretarial skills was all he bragged about. "She was the best, until she decided to make a move on me." Matthew stared at him blankly before he began to chuckle. "Okay, so she made a move on you, and you fired her?" he asked in confirmation. Jason nodded. "Man, are you gay?" "Tina is absolute beauty with brains," he exclaimed in amazement. Jason chuckled. "Don't insult me, bro, I love women. However, I am not a fan of fraternization in the workplace. It's strictly business for me," he explained firmly. Matthew nodded in understanding. "Okay, so where are you going to find a replacement?" "Well, I've already placed a notice in the papers and I'll be doing interviews tomorrow, so hopefully I'll find someone impressive," he sighed. "Oh, well, do what you've gotta do." Jason nodded. "So, ready to tell me about your problem?" Matthew thought about Kaylyn for a second and snorted. "Nah, this problem will give you a headache." Jason smiled and began to rise from his chair. "If you say so." "Well, I've gotta get going, I've got extra work on my hands." "Sure thing. Good luck." "Thanks." Jason replied before he exited the room. Matthew sighed once more, watching his friends retreat while he thought about Kaylyn and a different approach he could take to get around to her. Kaylyn was about to take a shower when she heard a knock at her door. She sighed, because the last thing she wanted was company. She felt droopy, and the only thing she wanted to do was take a shower and do some job hunting online. Laurily dragging herself to the door, Kaylyn opened it to find Faith with 2 bags in her hands. "Oh, it's you," she dully stated. "Well, you look like hell's cousin." Faith mocked as she stepped past Kaylyn. "What's up, Faith?" she asked, closing the door. "I bought you lunch," she called, making her way into the small kitchen. "I'm not hungry," Kaylyn murmured under her breath. Faith re-entered the living room with 2 plates in hand. "I bought you a vegetable salad and some juice." "I got myself a nice juicy burger with some crispy fries and a milkshake," she grinned in a conniving manner. "Why couldn't I have what you're having?" Kaylyn asked. "'Cause you've gotta eat healthy for the baby," she said, sticking out a tongue at Kaylyn. Kaylyn rolled her eyes. "Whatever." Faith laughed and took a seat on the sofa, handing Kaylyn her food. "So, speaking of the baby, when are you going to tell your parents?" she asked, biting into her burger. Kaylyn sighed. "Never." "Well, you'll have to tell them soon," Faith said with food-packed mouth. "I don't have to tell them anything," Kaylyn quipped. "They'll help if you do," Faith said. "I don't think so, and I've never depended on them for anything." "I won't start now," she bit out tersely. "I think now's the time you should let them in." "They're rich motherfuckers," Faith said, cocking a brow. "Can you please drop it? I don't want to spoil my mood." "Okay, fine," Faith huffed in defeat. There was a small silence. No one spoke, and all that could be heard was Faith's chewing. Oh, her voice rang out. She placed the food on a small table and reached for her handbag. What is it? Kaylyn asked in alarm. Faith was silent as she rummaged through her bag, pulling out a newspaper. She flipped the pages, still not answering Kaylyn. A grin broke across her face as she came upon what she was looking for. Shoving the article towards Kaylyn, she used her index finger to mark the spot she wanted Kaylyn to see. I saw this morning and thought it'd be perfect for you, she grinned. Kaylyn read its contents. Jason Fox, CEO of Felix Enterprises, was searching for an assistant who had a degree in business and was fluent in English and any other foreign language. Kaylyn stared at Faith wide-eyed. You're right, this is perfect for me, she smiled. Faith nodded. I know. Walk-in interviews are tomorrow at 8, so get the necessaries ready, and try to get a good sleep tonight. Kaylyn flung her arms around Faith. You're the best, she smiled, finding it hard to hold back the tears. Faith patted her back and smiled. I know. Well, with this job, you can find yourself a new apartment and get things started for the baby. It pays enough. Thanks, Tay, Kaylyn smiled. Don't mention it, she smiled. That night after Faith left, Kaylyn searched for her best suit and got all the necessary documents ready. She then took a long warm bath before she plopped down onto the bed, thinking of the possibilities that would arise if she was to in fact get the job. In one day, it seemed as if her world was going to crumble, and in another, things were starting to look up. Kaylyn wasn't sure, but she pondered the idea of this being the beginning of something new. There was some hope after all. Chapter 7. Excitement was what Kaylyn thought had woken her up the following morning. She was the one who rose before her alarm clock. She took a quick shower, although nausea was quietly seeping its way through her body. Earlier, she had picked out her best suit, a royal blue pencil skirt and a cream, silk, long-sleeved top. After taking her shower, she danced into her skirt, having to place much effort in the task. She squirmed when she realized she had gotten a bit fat, and there was a slight bulge in her stomach. Kaylyn wanted to cry at the idea of gaining weight so soon, unable to fathom what she would look like in the following months. Deciding that she wasn't going to change, she jiggled her way into the skirt and then the blouse, which didn't require much effort. Kaylyn stared at herself in the mirror and muttered a low curse. The suit was tight, although not cripplingly tight, but it hugged her hips too much, and that wasn't what she was aiming for. Sighing, she grabbed her heels, hopping into the 4-inch height. Kaylyn wasn't sure, but she pondered the idea of this being the beginning of something new. There was some hope after all. Chapter 7. Excitement was what Kaylyn thought had woken her up the following morning. She was the one who rose before her alarm clock. She took a quick shower, although nausea was quietly seeping its way through her body. Earlier, she had picked out her best suit, a royal blue pencil skirt and a cream, silk, long-sleeved top. After taking her shower, she danced into her skirt, having to place much effort in the task. She squirmed when she realized she had gotten a bit fat, and there was a slight bulge in her stomach. Kaylyn wanted to cry at the idea of gaining weight so soon, unable to fathom what she would look like in the following months. Deciding that she wasn't going to change, she jiggled her way into the skirt and then the blouse, which didn't require much effort. Kaylyn stared at herself in the mirror and muttered a low curse. The suit was tight, although not cripplingly tight, but it hugged her hips too much, and that wasn't what she was aiming for. Sighing, she grabbed her heels, hopping into the 4-inch height. She then grabbed her folder with her documents and her bag. Kaylyn moved towards the kitchen and poured herself a glass of fruit juice and grabbed a Nutri-Bar before she exited her flat. As she walked along the small corridor, she muttered a low curse when she felt her phone shrilling in her bag. She stopped and frustratingly rummaged through, pulling it out from the very bottom of the bag. "Hello," she answered, exasperatedly. "Oh, you're awake, good. Are you on your way?" "It's 7, and you should be there by 8, Faith ranted. "Yes, I'm just leaving my apartment," she reassured dully. "Good, got all your stuff?" Kaylyn smiled. "Yes, Mom," she mocked. Faith giggled. Okay, good luck. Thanks for everything, Faye. That's what friends are for, right? She exclaimed pointedly. Kaylyn grinned. Right, I'll call you later and tell you how everything goes. Sure thing, bye, she exclaimed before the line went dead. Taxi! Kaylyn yelled, using her hand to fan down a taxi that flew past without a glance. She huffed and glanced at her watch. 7:25 a.m. She had been standing there for nearly half an hour and she hadn't gotten any taxi, and the irony of it all was, on days when she wasn't in such a rush, taxis were always at her feet, and now that she couldn't get any. Talk about bad luck. She had already started to feel uneasy, standing for so long. Closing her eyes, she whispered a small prayer, asking God to work in her favor, and fortunately for her, it didn't go unanswered. Within the next 5 minutes, a yellow cab parked at her feet. Whispering a small thank you, she slid in, a sigh of relief escaping her lips as her butt made contact with the softness of the car seats. Where to, ma'am? The driver turned and asked. Telex Enterprises, she provided. The driver nodded and drove off. Daddy, can you drop me off to school today, please? I don't want Liz to drop me, Sapphire exclaimed, referring to the nanny. Matthew sighed, managing a smile. He had to be at work soon, so there was no way he could grant his daughter's wish. Honey, Daddy has to work. I'll try another time, he said softly. Sapphire pouted. I just want you to come so my friends can see you, she said, hanging her head sadly. Matthew sighed. Some other time, honey, I promise. Sapphire angrily slapped her cup from the table. You always say that, but you never come, she yelled, her small voice cracking with emotions. Getting up, she dashed from around the table in the direction of her room. Sapphire! Matthew called, muttering a low curse under his breath. He was about to go after her when Catherine marched through the front door. Good morning, darling, she cooed. I'm going to check Sapphire. I'll be out in a minute, he told her, stepping past her. You know, as soon as we're married she'll go off to boarding school, she called. Matthew only snorted. He paused at the door as he glared at his daughter's small form. Huddled on the bed, her body trembling with sobs. He suddenly felt guilty, knowing that he was the cause of her tears that always broke his heart. Saf, he softly said. She didn't answer, the sound of her sobs increasing. Matthew slowly walked by the bed and sat on the edge, laying a comforting hand across Sapphire's small back. I'm sorry, honey, he consoled. I want a mommy, she cried. The breath hitched in Matthew's throat at her words. Sapphire had never had the privilege of calling someone her mother because her own, Masha, died after giving birth to Sapphire. He swallowed the lump in his throat and gently massaged Sapphire's back. Catherine will become your mommy soon, he said, regretting the words as soon as they left his lips. I don't want her to be my mommy. I don't like her, she sniffed. Saf. I wish I had a different family, she murmured softly, her words like a dagger to Matthew's heart. After being pointed in the direction of the interview room, Kaylyn walked quickly but carefully to the area. It was 2 minutes to 8. She came to an area with a few persons sitting outside the door. She glanced at the door and realized it had the number the receptionist had told her. She took a seat in one of the empty chairs that was there while she noticed the others present. No one was familiar to her, they were all dressed in their best, their heads held high. She sat there with nothing to do, until she began to fidget with her fingers, realizing how seconds seemed like eternity. She sighed when suddenly a tall man stepped through the door. Kaylyn's forehead wrinkled, trying to place the man's face with the place she'd seen him. He looked so familiar. Good morning, he announced. My name is Jason Felix, he said as he moved to a woman beside him. These are the only persons I'll be taking today. If anyone comes, schedule another date, he murmured to the woman. Kaylyn knew it was impolite to stare, her mother had very strictly pointed out that fact as a child, but Kaylyn was finding it hard not to. She had seen him somewhere but couldn't quite place her finger on it. Seconds later, her eyes suddenly widened when realization dawned. He was the elevator man from when she had gone to visit Matthew Mayhew. Kaylyn felt a churning in the pit of her stomach as nervousness made its way through her body. She wanted to run. She watched as the man's eyes slowly assessed everyone before his gaze landed on her. His brows shot up, clearly shocked, as a slow smile played across his pale pink lips. Chapter 8. Kaylyn swallowed hard as she realized he too recognized her. What would he think of her now, when she had been so dismissive in the elevator? Kaylyn squirmed inwardly when a cluster of negative thoughts floated through her mind. Hanging her head, she settled her gaze in her lap, trying to distract herself from this situation even for a while so she could get her thoughts and nerves under control. "I will be starting with a Madeline Cowan," Jason exclaimed, Kaylyn's head immediately snapping up. She watched as a brunette stood and smiled before she walked in the room, Mr. Felix behind. Kaylyn sighed and huffed out a breath, hoping that all went well where she was concerned. Jason sat, pretending to listen to the woman who continuously bragged about her achievements. His thoughts had wandered off as soon as his mind flew back to one particular person. Kaylyn was the name she had provided when he'd asked. She was the only person he was interested in at the moment. After seeing her at Matthew's firm, he had not managed to get the image of the red-headed beauty from his thoughts. Now here she was, applying for a job in his enterprise. Jason smiled, thinking of how lucky he was, she had to do. He was interested in her. His forehead wrinkled when he thought back to the reason she might have had visiting Matthew's floor. Maybe she had been looking for a job, but Matthew had not told him about the woman or a job opening, and that made his interest in the woman grow even more. Not wanting to delay anything any longer, Jason refocused his attention to the woman who sat before him, still chatting unendingly. "Ms. Cowan, thank you for your time, and I'm sorry to say, but it was a waste of mine and yours." "You may go," he bit out, knowing that he sounded harsh, but such was life. The woman paled suddenly. "Sir?" she asked, blank and wide-eyed. "I will not be needing you," he clarified. The woman gaped at him, then blindly grabbed her bag, almost stumbling over her own feet as she rose from her chair. She almost ran from the room as tears flew from her eyes. Jason sighed and resisted the urge to roll his eyes, thinking he didn't need such a thin-skinned person anyway. Rising from his chair, he moved towards the door, knowing who he'd choose next. Kaylyn rested her head on the wall as she allowed her body to ease more comfortably in the chair. She felt like crap, along with the nausea and heat that was slowly creeping up on her. Regardless, she knew she had to compose herself for the interview. She tightly closed her eyes and allowed a wave of nausea to pass. She wanted to curl up in her bed and silently sob against the soft comfort of her pillow, but here she was, enduring discomfort so she could give future comfort to a new life. But those were the sacrifices people made, Kaylyn thought as she traced a hand across her face. "Are you okay, ma'am?" a man seated nearby asked. Kaylyn nodded, managing a stiff smile. The man looked unconvinced, but he didn't push it. Deciding to get some fresh air and throw some water over her face, Kaylyn stood, about to head to the bathroom when she saw a crying woman dash from the interview room, almost knocking her over in the process. Kaylyn almost toppled over from the sudden contact and the fact that she wasn't feeling well, but to steady herself, she eased against the wall for support. The boss, Mr. Felix, emerged from the room seconds later, his eyes glued to Kaylyn. "Come," he said with a half-smile as he disappeared into the room once more. The breath hitched in Kaylyn's throat. She still wasn't feeling well, but she was not going to let the possible opportunity pass. Stiffly, she walked towards the door, sighing heavily before she pushed it open. Jason smiled as he watched the woman walk in. She was beauty, although she had a ghost look on her face. Nervousness perhaps, he thought. His eyes traveled across the curvy contours of her body, noticing how slender she was, but full in all the right places. Her red hair was like fire. Bright, fiery, beautiful. "Take a seat," he smiled. Kaylyn smoothed her skirt, then took a seat, placing her bag on the floor. She straightened her posture and placed her hands on her lap. Her body screamed for her to get out, but her mind willed her to stay. "Your name," Jason began. "Kaylyn Fisher," she provided, almost shakily. Jason smiled. "There's no need to be nervous," he said with a reassuring smile. Kaylyn closed her eyes and sighed. I am not nervous," she trailed off, trying to compose herself, but she couldn't. "Are you okay?" Jason queried. "I'm sorry, I feel horrible," she exclaimed as she rose from her chair. Jason flew from his too, immediately moving from around his table. "What's wrong?" he pressed, face wrinkled in confusion. I am not feeling well," she trailed off as her vision blurred and her head swirled. Soon she faded into darkness, Jason immediately catching her before she fell to the ground. He muttered a curse and dug into his pocket for his phone, while his other hand held Kaylyn to his body. "Get my car ready, now," he growled onto the phone, then immediately disconnected. He lifted Kaylyn in his arms, bridal style, and carried her hastily through the door. Ignoring the frightened gasps of onlookers, he slid in an elevator. Jason felt panicked, because he had no idea what was wrong with her. She was still breathing, but she looked moonlight pale. He looked down at her face, noticing her softened features and the freckles that lightly dotted her nose. She was so beautiful. The big question still lingered in his mind. What was wrong with her? Jason was unsure, but he would get the truth as soon as he arrived at the hospital. Chapter 9. Kaylyn faintly opened her eyes upon hearing the whispers of persons her brain couldn't quite place. She felt tired and weak, her body drained. She winced when the light in the room scorched her eyes, a room she was not familiar with. "She's awake," she heard someone exclaim. Kaylyn sighed, then fully opened her eyes, concerned faces staring down at her. Faith was there alongside a doctor. Kaylyn's face wrinkled in confusion for a while, but her eyes widened almost instantly when realization dawned. She had fainted. Her throat suddenly felt parched when everything came rushing back, her mind only on one thing at the moment. "Is the baby okay?" she asked a bit huskily. Faith immediately came to her side and pulled her hands into hers, a warm smile on her face. "The baby's fine," she said with a slight squeeze. Kaylyn expelled a sigh of relief and tightly closed her eyes as a sob formed in her throat. "So what happened?" she asked when she was able to get a hold of herself. The doctor cleared his throat and stepped forward. "It's not unlikely to have women faint during pregnancy. You, however, were out for quite a while and that's unlikely. Your blood count is low, so that might have caused you to faint. I prescribed some iron tablets that will help, but if you have another faint spell, it is advised to visit me ASAP," the doctor provided with the highest level of professionalism. Kaylyn used the tip of her tongue to moisten her lips. "So if I faint again, it might be serious?" she asked brokenly. The doctor nodded. "I'm sure everything will be fine, Kay," Faith consoled, hugging Kaylyn, who was getting a bit scary. "It could be nothing, so please do not stress. You may leave when you're done," the doctor smiled, then left the room. Kaylyn sniffed. "What if something happens later in the pregnancy?" she croaked. "But what if nothing happens?" she challenged, cocking a brow. "You've gotta think positively, baby girl." Kaylyn managed a strained smile. "Thanks for everything, Tay." Faith huffed out a breath and fanned her off. "No need to thank me. You should be thanking the Greek god that brought you here," she grinned. Kaylyn made a face. "Greek gods tend to suffer from smallpox, Tay," she exclaimed. Faith burst out laughing, her head tilted backwards in amusement. Kaylyn grinned. "Where the hell did you hear that from?" she asked shakily, laughter still evident in her tone. "A movie," she grinned. Faith snorted. "So true though." "So, anyway, how did you know I was here?" Kaylyn asked quizzically. "I got a call from the man who brought you here. How he got my number, I don't know," she shrugged. "So where is he, by the way?" "Outside, I guess." "Not sure, but you owe him a huge thanks." "I know." "Yeah, get dressed so we can leave," Faith exclaimed, scooting off the bed. Jason sat on a chair that seemed to harden with every passing second. He had been there for about half an hour, not wanting to leave because he wanted to know how Kaylyn was, and he also wanted to see her. He sighed. It had shocked him when he came to know of her pregnancy, but shock was the only thing he felt. It didn't mitigate the interest he had in her. The answers would come soon enough, and then he'd know whether or not it would be ethical to pursue her. Jason knew there was a high chance of her having a partner, but he wasn't going to come to a conclusion based on silly assumption. There was just something about her that excited his interest. He sighed when he felt his phone vibrating in his pocket. He quickly pulled it out and rolled his eyes when he recognized the caller ID. "Matthew, what's up?" he exclaimed in frustration. "What's up with you?" he retorted pointedly. "I'm at the hospital," he offered. "I know that. I went to your office, and they told me you had to carry a girl there." "Heard she fainted." "Yeah, she did." "She okay?" Matthew asked. "Don't know as yet." "Well, I'm in that area, so I might swing by. Plus, there's something I need your advice on." "Okay, sure," Jason exclaimed, before he disconnected the call. He sighed heavily and closed his eyes, allowing his head to rest against the wall. Matthew was always a curious person, and Jason knew the only reason he wanted to swing by was so he could pry into the matter at hand. "Mr. Felix," a voice came. Jason immediately sat up in his chair. Kaylyn was standing before him with her friend by her side. He didn't speak for a while, only allowed his eyes to travel over the contours of her body. Some color had returned to her cheeks, he noted. She looked beautiful still, but also tired. He stood, directly facing Kaylyn. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. Kaylyn managed a smile. "I think I will be," she told him. "I'll be outside." "I'll leave you guys to talk," Faith put in. "Yeah, sure." An awkward silence followed after Faith's retreat. Kaylyn cleared her throat. "So, I just want to say thank you for bringing me here, and I'm also sorry for all the trouble." "No need to thank me, it wasn't a problem at all." "It was my pleasure," he reassured with a smile. "I really appreciate it." Silence and, "So, anyway, how did you know I was here?" Kaylyn asked quizzically. "I got a call from the man who brought you here." "How he got my number, I don't know," she shrugged. "So where is he by the way?" "Outside, I guess." "Not sure, but you owe him a huge thanks." "I know." "Yeah, get dressed so we can leave," Faith exclaimed, scooting off the bed. Jason sat on a chair that seemed to harden with every passing second. He had been there for about half an hour, not wanting to leave because he wanted to know how Kaylyn was, and he also wanted to see her. He sighed. It had shocked him when he came to know of her pregnancy, but shock was the only thing he felt. It didn't mitigate the interest he had in her. The answers would come soon enough, and then he'd know whether or not it would be ethical to pursue her. Jason knew there was a high chance of her having a partner, but he wasn't going to come to a conclusion based on silly assumption. There was just something about her that excited his interest. He sighed when he felt his phone vibrating in his pocket. He quickly pulled it out and rolled his eyes when he recognized the caller ID. "Matthew, what's up?" he exclaimed in frustration. "What's up with you?" he retorted pointedly. "I'm at the hospital," he offered. "I know that. I went to your office, and they told me you had to carry a girl there." "Heard she fainted." "Yeah, she did." "She okay?" Matthew asked. "Don't know as yet." "Well, I'm in that area, so I might swing by. Plus, there's something I need your advice on." "Okay, sure," Jason exclaimed, before he disconnected the call. He sighed heavily and closed his eyes, allowing his head to rest against the wall. Matthew was always a curious person, and Jason knew the only reason he wanted to swing by was so he could pry into the matter at hand. "Mr. Felix," a voice came. Jason immediately sat up in his chair. Kaylyn was standing before him with her friend by her side. He didn't speak for a while, only allowed his eyes to travel over the contours of her body. Some color had returned to her cheeks, he noted. She looked beautiful still, but also tired. He stood, directly facing Kaylyn. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. Kaylyn managed a smile. "I think I will be," she told him. "I'll be outside." "I'll leave you guys to talk," Faith put in. "Yeah, sure." An awkward silence followed after Faith's retreat. Kaylyn cleared her throat. "So, I just want to say thank you for bringing me here, and I'm also sorry for all the trouble." "No need to thank me, it wasn't a problem at all." "It was my pleasure," he reassured with a smile. "I really appreciate it." Silence intervened once more as both stood staring at each other, awkward smiles on faces. Kaylyn cleared her throat. "So, how did you get in contact with Faith?" she asked. Jason scratched his head nervously. He trailed off with a sigh. "Forgive me, but I went through your purse, searching for some kind of information. I found her name and number in a small notebook." He confessed. Kaylyn chuckled lightly. "It's fine, I'm glad you called her." He nodded with a half-smile, grabbing his jacket from the chair he had earlier occupied. "Well, I take it you need some rest, so you better get going." "Yeah." They began walking in silence, Kaylyn feeling as awkward as a nerd at a strip joint. "Sorry for ruining your interview by the way," she blurted. "You didn't ruin anything." "I had one person in mind all along," he admitted, smiling. Kaylyn nervously fidgeted with her fingers. "Oh," was all she managed to say. Jason chuckled at her obvious oblivion. "That person is you," he said, stopping in front of her. "You?" she asked blankly, her eyes widening almost instantly. "Me?" she gasped. Jason grinned. "Yes, I want you to come work for me. That is, if you are up for it." Kaylyn gaped at him, trying to find the words to say, but everything was just heavy on her tongue, leaving her momentarily speechless. "Of course I'm up for it," she blurted loudly, immediately covering her mouth. Jason laughed. "Good, you can start on Monday." "Really?" She earned a grin from Jason. "Yes, really," he confirmed, finding it quite pleasing to see her so happy. "Oh my God, thank you so much," she exclaimed with a sniff, not even realizing that she was crying. "Ugh, I'm sorry," she sniffled, brushing the tears away. "You're most welcome." They reached the outside, the sun warming their skin. "I guess this is it, I'll see you Monday," Jason said. "Yeah." "Jason," a voice in the distance came. Jason turned to see Matthew walking towards them. "Oh, hey man," Jason began. "You?" Kaylyn interjected crisply, the familiar despise she had earlier felt for him, returning. "Well, I'll be damn," Matthew retorted with just as much shock. Jason stood there, clueless. Chapter 10. Jason stood there staring at Kaylyn then Matthew, lines of confusion wrinkling his forehead. "Do you two know each other?" he asked, his curiosity piqued. There was a small silence. Matthew stood there, mouth slightly opened in shock, staring at Kaylyn with curiosity, as if trying to place the missing pieces together. "Is she the woman who fainted, Jason?" he asked Jason a bit eagerly. Yeah," he said, rubbing his temples of what might seem to be an impending headache. Matthew's eyes widened as he gaped at Kaylyn, looking at her from head to toe. "What's wrong?" he exclaimed, examining her face. Kaylyn sighed and hoisted her bag further on her shoulder. "I should get going, Faith's waiting," she glanced at Jason. "Thanks for everything." She strolled off, but Matthew grabbed her by the arm. Kaylyn spun around suddenly, glaring at Matthew's hand on her arm. Then at him, the challenge evident in her eyes. "What's wrong with the baby?" he asked anyway, his tone hard and demanding. "Wait, how?" Jason began. "I don't have to answer to you," Kaylyn fired at Matthew. "Don't bullshit me." "What's wrong with the baby?" he rasped. Kaylyn snorted, not cowering under the intensity of his gaze. "Don't pretend to care. It doesn't suit you," she spat, then pulled her arm from his hold. What's going on here? Jason demanded in frustration. Kaylyn sighed. I'm really not in the mood for this, she said, shaking her head before briskly walking towards Faith's car. Matthew muttered a low curse and ran a hand through his hair in frustration. What caused her to faint? He asked Jason evenly. Why are you so curious about the well-being of a stranger? He asked quizzically. That woman is carrying my child, damn it, he ground out ruefully. That left Jason speechless. He stood transfixed, processing the information. He found it hard to believe. As a matter of fact, he did not believe it one bit, and so, thinking of it as a joke, he began laughing. You know, Matthew, I've never considered you the funny type, but boy, you just proved me wrong, he exclaimed, mirth in his tone. Matthew shook his head. Look, I've gotta go and find out what happened. I'll talk to you later. Jason stared at him intently, the seriousness on his face telling him that he was not joking at all. He was indeed serious. Matthew, is she really carrying your child? He asked lowly. Matthew nodded. Jason gaped. Now how the fuck did that happen? He spat in disbelief. You just said it, he cocked a brow. Jason huffed out a breath. You do realize that you're engaged, right? Matthew rolled his eyes. Look man, I'll talk to you later. I have something I've got to do, he exclaimed, and without awaiting a reply from Jason, he strolled off. What happened back there? Faith asked as they drove in the direction of Kaylyn's apartment. Kaylyn stared blankly out the window. Jason met Mayhew, she drawled lazily. So. They are friends, I think, she informed. Okay, so let me get this straight. Your hero is friends with your arch-nemesis? She asked. Kaylyn rolled her eyes. Yes, and how can I even take that job, Faith? Things will definitely be awkward and Matthew will be around, she sighed. You got the job? Kaylyn managed a smile and nodded. That's awesome, she yelled in excitement. Kaylyn grinned. I guess. Girl, you better lose that attitude. This job is a big deal for you, and if you allow that pompous pig of a baby daddy to get to your head, this friendship is over. Nada. Zitch, she ground out firmly. If he knows I'm working with his friend, he will always be around. Yes, and you're gonna show him that you can survive without him. You and your baby, Faith interjected. Well, that is if he still wants me to work for him after he finds out I'm having a child with his friend. Matthew's engaged and Jason will think I'm a slut. Faith smacked her at the back of her head. Ow, what was that for? Kaylyn exclaimed a bit shocked. For being so damn negative. Jason seems like a nice man and tough businessmen like him know that business is business and that there's no room for personal issues, she exclaimed in a motherly tone. But. No buts, unless you're talking about Nick Bateman's, she said pointing at Kaylyn with a grin. Kaylyn conceded in defeat as they drove in silence for the remainder of the journey. Matthew honked in frustration at the traffic ahead. He slammed his hands against the steering wheel and ran his hand through his hair. Muttering a curse, he leaned one hand against the door and rubbed at his temple. His eagerness to see Kaylyn was unexplainable. He was worried, angered, and frustrated. How could she not call him when she fainted? He probably wouldn't have known if he hadn't decided to go to the hospital. That made him furious, because when a pressing matter such as the one at hand presented itself, he demanded to know. He knew he shouldn't care as much about someone who was probably telling him a lie, scheming to get at him, but when he saw that Kaylyn and the baby was in possible danger, a sensitive side had kicked in and in that moment, all he wanted was to know and make sure she was okay. He also wondered if the baby was okay or if she was. Damn, he didn't know anything. He felt like a complete stranger intruding on matters that did not concern him, which was bullshit. He had a right to know about everything concerning her and the baby. Matthew huffed. And what was she doing at Jason's building anyway? Seeking a job? He thought. No way in hell. Matthew honked once more when the traffic was clearing, but a single car in front of him did not move along, like pressed his palm to the horn, the sound ongoing and loud. The person ahead stuck his middle finger through the window before he drove off. Matthew shook his head and sighed before he sped off to demand answers from one particular person. "Thanks for dropping me off," Kaylyn said when she was standing at the door to her flat. Faith nodded, smiling. "If you need me, just remember," she cleared her throat. "I'm only one call away," she sang, mimicking the words of Charlie Puth's "One Call Away." Kaylyn laughed as she shoved the key through the keyhole. "I will. I'll call you later," she said, shoving the door open. Faith patted her on the shoulder before she left. Kaylyn closed the door and sighed, plopping herself on the sofa. She kicked off her shoes and rested her head against the sofa, closing her eyes, allowing the events of the day to pass through. She was on the verge of dozing off when a knock sounded at the door, causing her eyes to snap open. Kaylyn groaned and lazily dragged herself from the seat. She pulled the blouse from the skirt and used her hand to free her hair of the styled hair. "What did you forget, Faith?" She swung the door open and paused when she saw who was really there. "You again? What do you want?" she sighed tiredly. "We need to talk," Matthew exclaimed, moving past her.